This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
What I want to do this evening is to give you some sense of who I am, what I did, and whatever that blurb was that I wrote up about what is the lesson of cancer and chronic disease. But for the second half of this evening, I want to open it to totally your questions. I don't want to assume that everything I have to say is necessarily what you want to hear. And also, I also assume that I am preaching to the choir a bit. And I am fairly certain I'm going to say a lot of things that you already know to start. But I will at least share with you what I did, why I did it, and why I think it worked, and what I think is important if we're going to be effective in managing chronic disease, certainly including cancer. It may also help you to know that there was a time in my life where I didn't believe pretty much anything I'm about to tell you. But I tell you that for a reason, because even though I have a very strong metaphysical background, I didn't really get into that till about 1977, and didn't go back to graduate school. Never even occurred to me to go to graduate school until about 1980. So part of a dilemma I was sharing with my friend Jodine is that I knew an awful lot about intuition and other ways to determine what's true before I ever went to graduate school. So it was very stressful for me to be in graduate school for two reasons. I couldn't talk about what was really important to me because I was truly fearful that it wouldn't get me very far in terms of getting my graduate degrees if I would talk about something so extremely subjective when we're taught to be extremely objective. I did my doctoral dissertation on guided imagery, and that happened because I, in 1977, met a fellow who had a self-help type program. He actually, at that time, I think, was Silva Mind Control's most successful lecturer. But now he had branched off on his own. He was probably the wisest, most loving person I've ever met in my life, mostly self-taught, although he had lots of degrees, and self-taught primarily through meditation, which really fascinated me. I suspect would fascinate you, that was his primary knowledge base. And then when I went to graduate school, I was thrilled when I was given the opportunity to study guided imagery academically. And at that time, it wasn't very popular, to be honest. Carl Simonton had come out and promoted guided imagery with cancer. I think his major book, Getting Well Again, his first book was written in '78 maybe. And I suspect many, if not all of you, know that that was not well received, certainly not in the medical community. Here was Carl Simonton, a medical doctor trained in Oregon, I don't know if you know that, and radiation oncologist, but here he is pioneering psychosocial approaches to cancer care. And when you are in any scientific field, but certainly medicine, and you promote other than medical approaches to any diagnosis, but something as serious as cancer, I can just tell you even today it's not well received. So imagine Carl's dilemma back then trying to do this. He at least attempted to research what he was doing and published it, interestingly, in an Australian journal, their major medical journal. It wasn't accepted for publication here. They wouldn't do it. And preceding him, you probably know about Larry LaShawn and his work with cancer. And he attempted to do some research also, but none of it was methodologically strong enough to really make the claims they were making, at least to a scientific audience. But there was nothing like Bernie Siegel. When he wrote Love, Medicine, and Miracles, and it became the most popular book by far on psychosocial approaches to cancer care, It just seemed to bring down the house in terms of we're going to make sure that these approaches are labeled the worst, and do research actually to show that this couldn't work. And so you're probably familiar with David Spiegel's research at Stanford, where he actually was funded because he tried to prove this wouldn't work. And if you really know that study, published in Lancet, it showed that support groups actually doubled the life expectancy of women with breast cancer. And it was fascinating to see him turn around so that where he actually started out, and I really believe that's why he got funded, because he was trying to prove this wouldn't work, and it worked very well. So I was encouraged, obviously, as you might imagine, in my interest in guided imagery, to have these people doing this kind of work, but I had no idea how I would ever apply guided imagery. I'm assuming you know what guided imagery is. Tell you? Okay. It's essentially, could I call it mental rehearsal? If we learn something observing someone, however we might call it modeling, understand that that learning is just a representation in your brain, but you learn from observing. Well, essentially guided imagery is you're doing your own modeling. And if you could think of rehearsal is simply repetition of doing a certain thing, well, but you're doing it yourself. And now there's tremendous evidence that if you couple mental rehearsal with physical rehearsal, I think of the Olympics, which just passed. They've actually done a fair amount of research with Olympic athletes. And it's pretty consistent that if you couple the mental rehearsal with the physical, normal physical practice, you do considerably better, actually. How did I do? So when I finally got out of school, my first position was a staff psychologist in a rehabilitation hospital, people primarily recovering from strokes. And I was blessed that my director of psychology was a biofeedback proponent and practitioner, which ties in directly to guided imagery. And so I had a very valuable experience there, which included, it's kind of funny to be in a corporate situation. They give you money for continuing education to actually go do this. Or now I've been self-employed for so very long, the idea that someone give me money to go do that sounds pretty cool. And I was fascinated by Carl Simonton's work, as I mentioned, but it was very expensive to go study with Carl. But I thought, you know what, if I get this extra money, I'll throw in my money too, and off I went to intern with Carl Simonton. I'm presuming, again, I've already introduced him well enough that you can appreciate who he is. And he would have these week-long programs with cancer patients and families, and I was thrilled to be with someone who, especially if you've read Getting Well Again, or I really should speak for myself, I just thought it was a superb little book. And within that first week of meeting, we agreed that I would help him research his program. And I went back to my rehab hospital and told about my experience, and they were intrigued and actually asked me to set up an oncology protocol for a program in this rehab hospital, which really caught me off guard. But I thought, this is great. But it also was a little spooky in that, oh my God, now I have to really take this seriously. And I called Carl and I said, Carl, we have an opportunity to do this, to really test this. And I got the attention of a radiation oncologist in our town who was willing to refer his patients, and we were going to do this. So I ran back out and did another internship with Carl, and we set up, you know, basically what I might do. It's very different. If you go to Carl's program, you would have read his book before he even admitted to his week-long program. Here I am in central Pennsylvania, and trust me, people were not familiar with Carl Simonton. And I remember when Carl would talk, and in the very first lecture, he would say, cancer means you need to change. And I go, you know, this is not going to fly in central Pennsylvania. But I'm being really serious about this because I'm trying now to adopt or adapt his program where I live and work and yet still test his program. So it was a very interesting situation. But Carl was pretty good, and he said, you know, let's just make sure we cover the basic things. And he knew I'd been teaching that self-help program for 10 years at least. I just gotten out of graduate school, so I was pretty familiar with the research or whatever that was there, and he gave me his blessing to do this. My rehab hospital sat on it. The protocol never followed through. But that was probably the blessing. That then I went to the oncologist who had actually told me that he was part of a physician management group of multiple cancer centers and wanted someone like me to help them develop psychosocial services. Anyhow, but I didn't know him. I wasn't really ready to just say, sure, you know, hey, you refer your people here, let's see how this goes. But of course that didn't happen, so I went back to him now and I said, are you still interested in having me do that? Yes. So then I had this responsibility of developing this program, but now I was feeling pretty confident and comfortable. I just had to go teach it. And it's before we're done to 40 different cancer centers, which obviously is not simple to do. I'm one person. And we tried to find people to help. It didn't go so well. Anyhow, in attempting to do that research to see if in fact Carl's program, which I find most people believe, and the media certainly did, pretty much, you know, Carl Simonton's name and guided imagery are in the same breath or sentence. And it is way more. If you're not really familiar with the Simonton approach, it's really about getting people to move toward what brings them greater joy. That's the huge part of that program. Guided imagery is a tool which can be extremely effective. But anyhow, so I approached it with the idea of the will to live. When I went out and I would talk about it, and if I would ask you, as I would ask thousands of people I did over time, do you think that having a strong will to live makes a difference in your health? And I don't think I ever had anyone say no. But this was what was really, really fascinating. Here I was in place to try to teach you to do more of what you love to do. In fact, if you think it's a license to steal, here were your doctors coming to you and telling you, diagnosed and being treated for cancer, that what we wanted you to do and take very seriously was to do more of what you love to do. In fact, if you were getting beat up by your treatments, if you were running out of energy, I said go fishing first. You know, do the things you think you should do afterwards. So if you run out of steam, you run out of the things you think you should do, but you've done what you really wanted to do. And we would actually write prescriptions. Again, this may sound very novel or silly. On one level, you come in with something as serious as cancer, and we're telling you, you need to talk on the phone so often. That was probably the most popular one, especially for women. And bingo was big. I don't know if bingo's big here, but it was very big in central Pennsylvania that you had to play bingo so often. And see, it's silly, isn't it? But we know so much more today in terms of my field, mind-body medicine, and certainly now with the science of psychoneuroimmunology, that every thought and every feeling you have is reflected in your immune system. And every major illness pretty much is affected by your immune system. So when you're going fishing, and I should preface why I'm calling this going fishing. Where I lived when I first started to work at this rehab hospital, the edge of my backyard was the largest, most popular trout stream in Pennsylvania. And my little town, or really was a little town, was actually called Fisherman's Paradise. And what was fascinating is that I grew up in central Pennsylvania, and I knew how important sports like trout fishing and especially deer hunting were. And while this may not appeal to you, in central Pennsylvania, they literally closed schools the first day of trout season, first day of buck season, first day of doe season. We lost up to 2/3 of our cancer patients the first week of buck season. So I say this is not normal behavior, but it may help you appreciate how much meaning this had for those people. So I quickly decided, rather than try to talk like the scientist, is to use terms and experiences they could relate to around, okay, if you went fishing, if you were to truly adopt this attitude of a will to live, I'm going to do more of what I really, really want to do, and the doctors are telling me this is important, then maybe they could relate to that better than if I used more formal terms and so forth. So what happened was, I found very quickly that people were not going fishing. That we as a people, certainly in our culture, have come to believe that everybody else comes first, and somehow that's more appropriate than doing for ourselves. Now, I believe balance is always the key, so I'm not saying go out and just think about yourself, but I will tell you, without reservation, that in my experience, and I want to say even as cool as you are or you think you are, I'm going to bet, because I did this for too many years and worked with thousands of people, you wouldn't be much better than they were. That you are so deeply programmed that everybody else comes first, that it was very difficult for them, and I would bet difficult for you, to make that major change in your life. That you would actually take time in balance to do what you really want to do, along with being, forgive these stereotypes, but as a woman the nurturer, or as the male the provider, and going outside of these learned roles, like you're supposed to like deer hunting if you grew up where I grew up. I mean, the idea that you would say deer hunting is not a good idea, you know, you didn't want to say that publicly, kind of. It was just that way. But think of within any given community, wherever you grew up or here, there is no way you were not exposed to, especially your parents, and this is not about blaming your parents, but what they believe. And when you're young, you're this sponge, and you just take on essentially their beliefs and their fears and whatever else, and this is like the beginning of the end, or what really I think causes our problems in terms of, you just name the disease process, but it starts there. In that you now adopt kind of this defensive, the world is not friendly attitude, and basically get into a survival mode, and what I need to do to fit in or to be successful, and again, largely based on your home, your community, your culture's ideas of what that means. And appreciate that at some point down the road you realize, you know, that doesn't fit. But the ideas are so deeply conditioned that I believe honestly that we have learned to equate conforming with feeling loved. And so now, at a deep level, so now when I tell you to go fishing, at a deep level, you're not going to want to do this because it will mean you're not going to feel loved. And where I'm headed with this is I think that's what's actually key in terms of what's truly healing is when one feels loved. But are you with me so far? Yes. Okay. So I'm in this unique position, and I wasn't going to give up on the will to live. I believe so strongly, and some people did it. Believe me, some people did it. And Hearn tells me, tell stories. I like to hear stories, so I'm going to tell a story. And remember, this is anecdotal and it's one patient. I don't want to propose to you that everybody did what he did as well as he did, but in the end, I'm going to tell you in my research, people definitely did better. They lived longer. So it's not like what I'm telling you is that isolated. Anyhow, Bud, I was down at a cancer center near Philadelphia, in a suburb of Philadelphia, and I'm recruiting people. I would be there all day long to meet with patients and, you know, tell them, you know, that I wanted them to be part of this group. Their doctors did, and otherwise I'd be available if I could help them or their families. Anyhow, Bud comes in, and I'm surprised because Bud was in a wheelchair, and I would never normally talk to a patient about a prognosis, but I know your medical records. I want to know before I talk to you, you know, what's happening. Well, Bud wasn't supposed to live 2 more months. So it's like I was surprised I'm meeting Bud at all. And then he's going to come to my class. Bud shows up, and he's in bad pain. And he's doubled over in his wheelchair, and I'm telling about guided imagery. And that you can, I used to call this Walt Disney, all you have to do is wish upon a star and your dream comes true kind of stuff. Because if you think of one level, isn't that almost what it sounds like? I can just imagine myself, well, hell, when I worked in that rehab hospital and people with strokes and major pain, I used to joke I was glad my desk was as wide as it was. You'd have reached across and slugged me. Because usually by the time you were seeing me, you had exhausted all your other medical options, and now I'm going to tell you can imagine your pain away. So again, appreciate my situation in working with Bud, and he was one of those. You must be out of your mind. But what really was interesting that night is I didn't even have to respond. The rest of the class did, and started citing personal examples or other evidence that indeed you can do this. Well, Bud kind of sat back, but I thought, well, this is Bud's last class for sure. Bud kept coming back. But here was Bud's problem. These classes went for 6 weeks. Bud's not supposed to last maybe 9. So at the end of the 6 classes, he comes to me and says, what am I supposed to do? I mean, medically, he's been told he's going to be dead now in less than a month. He said, I want to buy a new boat. Now, it's kind of fun that we can smile about this. I'm going to tell you, when you're in that situation, this is really not funny. Because, I mean, think about if you want the boat, but what about your family? Do you have any idea what your medical expenses are like? And this character wants to spend $10,000 on a new boat, and he's probably not going to be alive in a month. What would you tell him? Think about this seriously. Okay, all right, but maybe again I'm preaching to the choir, you're making this too easy. Because in the end I would tell you, live like you're going to live. I'm serious about that. But I could not and would not even to this day say, Bud, buy that boat. But I didn't say don't buy the boat. And as you might imagine where my story is headed, Bud bought the boat. And he didn't die. I'm getting emotional, I'm sorry. Bud did die by the end of that year, but we're talking many months later. Right. Bud and Shirley said they had the time of their life. Wow. And so, again, it's one of those stories that kind of, this is why you do this stuff. But, again, I have to be honest and say, most people weren't like Bud. And forgive me again, and I don't think you could. And so that's partly what I would like to tell you and have you take this so seriously, because I know you've heard this message. I mean, Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss. You don't do this. People didn't do this. So it was really fascinating when I ended up, the research that Carl and I initially started out to absolutely fell apart. If you've ever tried to do research and data collection, this is not a fun process. But I was blessed where I actually lived. I told you I lived in Fisherman's Paradise, but it was just this little town outside of State College, Pennsylvania, which is where Penn State University is based. So I was fortunate that someone from the biobehavioral health department at Penn State was very interested in what I was doing and said he knew that he could find a way to research this. And indeed he did. It required a lot more data collection, but in the end, we were able to show, and also I went to our physicians to say, listen, I don't want to waste my time and I don't want to be laughed at. You know, too many people have been down that road. So I said, here's our proposed study, and what are the variables that I need to control for if we're going to do something that you would actually read and respect? So because I had been teaching this program for a number of years now, I couldn't start it off as a new study. How could we go back, though, and still determine whether or not people who had gone through the program had actually benefited or lived longer than someone who had not? So we had what we called a matched control study, where we took patients who had the exact same disease, same stage of disease, same age at diagnosis, a number of variables, including they all were getting treatments from the same place, same doctors, and it was a pretty good study, to be honest. And what we found was that in the end, research is a lot about numbers. You have to have enough people to analyze before you can do it. We only had enough numbers with stage 1 prostate and stage 1 breast cancer to analyze. In the end, we had 50 total compared to 139 controls, which is really good and unusual to have really close matches, to have 2 or 3 for every one of your treatment subjects. And for the women who had stage 1 breast cancer, and we looked at after 4 to 7 years intervention, so they had been through my classes either 4 through 7 years ago, that none of the women with stage 1 breast cancer who had gone through my classes had died. 12% of the control group died. And with stage 1 prostate, 14% of my men died in that time period. 28% of the control group died. So we had a good study. And it was nice to be able to support Carl, just to be able to support, and not necessarily just I want to promote guided imagery or I want to promote the will to live, just that there's something else we can do. And the good news is that we can do it ourselves. The bad news is you have to do it yourself. And I mean it, and that's what I ended up telling people. Here's the good news and here's the bad news. One, it works. Two, you have to do it. And so it caught me off guard again because I thought I was giving you the easiest way out imaginable. The thing you had to do was go fishing. I mean, how tough is this? Again, we gave you this license to steal, you wouldn't do it. So it was interesting when I went to write up the research, and there's other fascinating parts of this, and I'm just a person, you know, trying to figure this out like everybody else, but, you know, I had the opportunity to work with Carl Simonton, and then when, you know, it was a really interesting coincidence. I'm down in Florida at Disney World with all of our physicians in our oncology group and all the families. They're there for this major conference, and I'm there presenting for them and families. So my wife and I are there. I probably make 2 presentations in a week and get to play the rest of the time. Very cool. But fascinating, the very next week, same hotel, same place, as a huge mind-body conference. Larry Dossey, Carl Simonton, Marty Rossman, Gene Ochterberg, all of my friends and colleagues who are very invested in this study. And Ray Palmer, this epidemiologist from Penn State, came down, and we all met, and then Gene Ochterberg's husband was a true statistician, Frank Lawless. Ray and Frank sit down, go over this data. Carl and I run to the grocery store, buy a bunch of wine, we're going to celebrate. The very next day, Larry Dossey asked me to publish this research in his journal. So there was a lot of good points, but a lot of, I have to just tell you, when you, well, I'm not telling you anything new. When you're trying to do something alternative in a very conventional setting, is I feel blessed to have had that opportunity. But I have to tell you, I walked a tightrope plenty times in trying to present that kind of information. But I felt blessed that I was able to do that and work with some of the people I did. So now I'm about to write up the research. And Gene Ochterberg, who is an editor with his journal, said, firstly, people are going to want to know, how is it that they lived longer after 12 hours of instruction over 6 weeks? I mean, even to Gene Ochterberg, it's like, how could this have worked? And when you write up your research, you probably want to address that. Well, now my dilemma was, remember, I'm promoting that you're supposed to go fishing, and you didn't do it. So why did my people live longer? Right. And what you don't do in a scientific article is talk about your clinical experience or be anecdotal. But I was given permission to do that, which was highly unusual. So at the end of the article, you know, I try to say it in this very controlled way. You know, we're very reluctant to talk about, you know, this skeptical, but then I did. And here's what I believed, and I think is essential as part of understanding and if we're going to deal effectively with chronic disease. When I would have to go to so many different cancer centers, as I did at first, I truly, every day I was at a different cancer center. These were long days. Fortunately, I was single still. I had my own life, and I could just do this. And after I would teach a 6-week program, I usually had to jump off and go teach it somewhere else. Often, though, I would stay for a while, and I developed a real rapport with the people. And before I would go on to another cancer center, I would ask very sincerely, what worked, what didn't? Please help me help you. Believe me, I taught them guided imagery, stress management, intuitive approaches, so many things. But I didn't want to assume that they all worked like I found going fishing. You know, even though I liked the idea, they didn't do it. Anyhow, when I remember this one cancer center in particular, when I asked that question, and I knew them well, and I asked, okay, what helped you the most? And the first response back was that I listened. And I have to tell you sincerely how confused I was by that response. I mean, I'm the teacher. For 6 weeks, actually longer, as I taught more series of classes, I'm basically up there, and I'm telling you things you can do to improve your situation, manage your symptoms, whatever. So I was sure I simply must not have asked my question properly, clearly enough. So I rephrased it. I even gave them some examples to make sure they understood what I was looking for. And the next thing they said that helped them the most was that I cared. Now I'm really puzzled, and I'm actually almost mad. Because here I'm a psychologist. I kind of pride myself on, and I lectured thousands of times, I have a pretty good idea what I'm saying. I think I can say it fairly well. Why aren't you getting this? So I asked my question again and gave more examples. The next thing that helped them the most was that I was sincere. I believe it or not, I finally started to get it. Now, this is one of those anecdotal experiences again, but how do you write this up in a research article? But I did. But I tied it to, and I don't want to say this like this was just my out. I believe this. If you're familiar with Dean Ornish's research with heart disease, Dean Ornish's program for reversing heart disease, and then his later book, Love and Survival, most people, and I guess I refer to the media here as well, look at Dean Ornish's program largely as there's a very strict vegetarian diet, and that's why his program worked. Dean, in fact, is very clear that it was the stress management component that was by far the biggest factor why that program worked, why people were able to reverse their heart disease. And what he said in his first book, which is just superb, it's like a Bible. If you want to just read one book in your life about how to take care of yourself, Dean Ornish's program, Reversing Heart Disease, is quite a book. And
is that the name of it?
It is.
Reversing Heart Disease.
Right. And anyhow, he talks about how that these psychosocial factors make a huge difference in reversing heart disease. And one of the primary factors was loneliness, he found, really was a major underlying factor for heart disease. Maybe he would even say probably the largest factor that underlied heart disease. So when he wrote Love and Survival, he even italicized this in his own book when he wrote this. He said, there is nothing in medicine that is more effective in quality or length of life. Nothing from any medical treatment to smoking to substance abuse, stress, anything, nutrition, than feeling loved and cared for. And if you read Love and Survival, he makes an extremely strong case for that. And again reflects back to childhood, what happens where we early on learn to feel loved only when largely we're doing what other people think we should. It's really, again, largely your parents. You feel loved when you're doing what they want versus you're not really given freedom to think about being unique. I'll give you unique. I mean, if you didn't get it at home, where did you went to school and see how unique you got to be and how important it was to try to fit in. So it was this huge catastrophic experience about trying to fit in, and fear of rejection underlies everything. But here's Ornish pointing it out with heart disease. And I was certain of it in my work with cancer. And so when I was writing up my article, I referred to Ornish's work and conclusions, and they almost couldn't have been more similar. I'm saying when you feel listened to and cared for, and he's saying loved and cared for. And then here's the topper, which is, it's really personal, but this is the one that got me to put it together for me. Back in 1993, Bill Moyers wrote a book and a video about healing. I forget the exact title, about Healing in the Mind. That's probably it. Thank you. Excellent, excellent stuff. And if you saw the video, which was broadcast on PBS, it starts off with Eisenberg, Dr. Eisenberg, who did that wonderful study at Harvard, showing that people are going to alternative therapists more than their primary physicians today for their care. The most cited medical journal article in history, to show you how much attention that article got. Anyhow, wonderful documentary about alternative approaches to healthcare around the world. That same year on TBS, there was a video called The Heart of Healing. And it was about people who had used these different alternative therapies, telling their very personal stories and why they believed they reversed their terminal illnesses using these alternative approaches when conventional approaches didn't. And it was within this video, there's a segment that got my attention. And it started with an interviewer, narrator, being in Lourdes, France. And they're going to talk about miracles. Now, this is novel for me if you have my scientific background, because miracles can't happen in science. It's anathema to science. So I'm going, well, this is going to be interesting. How are they going to talk about miracles? And he's talking to the medical director at Lourdes. So I'm going, this is really interesting. He's in Lourdes, France, if you know anything about miracles, but he's the medical director. And when, in a very non-threatening tone, I was very aware of how this was going to be presented. It wasn't like, yeah, how do you explain this stuff? It was very neutral. It's like, please explain to me how you understand miracles. And this doctor, I'm sure I wouldn't pronounce his name correctly, but anyhow, he said, these people had a strong faith that someone loved them. This is the medical doctor's response to that question. And I'm going, what's wrong with this picture? And at least from my perspective, what I was anticipating, and it didn't compute. In the meantime, of course, the documentary is going on, and now in a totally separate interview, they're at the Vatican. No, well, this will be interesting. So they're interviewing this father, this major Catholic somebody, and when he was asked to explain miracles, and I should mention as an interesting aside, to be declared a miracle by the Catholic Church is a miracle. I think there are 64 or 65 literal declared miracles by the Catholic Church. The criteria to be a miracle in the Catholic Church is way beyond science. Anyhow, this father says, essentially came out, God loves me. Almost repeating the words of the medical director, these people knew someone loved them, truly loved them. And I remember him thumping his chest, God loves me, God loves me. And I'm reeling in my seat thinking about this. Here I am trying to do this research and this work, and it's like, how the hell do I get to say that in my hospitals? But of all things, I'm going, there's got to be something to this, and it's not like I don't know about the placebo effect and the power of beliefs or faith, but they're talking about love. Now, how do you quantify that stuff, let alone talk about it? Dean Ornish was very clear when he wrote his books and wrote up his research. He wouldn't dare mention love. In fact, when he reviewed all the scientific literature on heart disease, there wasn't one mention of love. So that was that fall of '93. Now it's spring of '94. And I'm watching Oprah Winfrey. And this isn't, I like Oprah Winfrey, so but I don't say it's not like I normally don't watch. I don't watch. In fact, I don't even own television now. But I was watching Oprah Winfrey, and of all things that you think about what's coincidental, I actually chose to tape that show. Maya Angelou was the guest, so I'm kind of remembering with my friend Joe Dean, maybe that's why I was watching it all, and that's why I was taping it. If you know anything about Maya Angelou, or if you don't, you should. She's pretty special to hear her speak. So Oprah's being a very Oprah self, personable, and Maya's a friend. And she asked Maya what it was like to be asked by the White House to write the poem for President Clinton's inaugural ceremony back in '93. And Maya said, my knees went to water. In fact, I think I remember that she probably said to some aside, like at first, she thought it was a joke that someone was even calling her, and yeah, right. And finally took a while to, oh my God, they're serious. But then, if you know it, Maya, she went into this, she just talks from the depth of her being anyhow, but I just knew that I could do this. And, made some reference to that I'm a child of God like everybody else, carrying wisps of glory. And I could do it. And so she said that whenever she felt like maybe she couldn't do something or whatever, she said, I just knew that if I had to go from darkness to darkness, that I would always be able to do it, knowing, guess what? God loves me. And she reflected back, actually after Oprah asked another question around, was that one of your proudest moments? And Maya said, you know what, people think that public recognition as such is special. But she said she found that these more private moments, personal moments of reflection were actually more meaningful for her. And she then reflected back to the 1950s when a spiritual and voice teacher told her, guess what? God loves me. And that she carries that through to this day, that no matter what happens in her life, that's what sustains her. God loves me. And Oprah ended that show with, what I will leave today remembering is God loves me. So I'm thinking back, okay, the medical director at Lourdes, this father at the Vatican, Maya and Oprah, and it's just one of those personal experiences when the aha happens. It was like, oh my God. And I was comfortable personally going outside of science to appreciate why something as metaphysical, as non-scientific as love could work. But now, all of a sudden, what occurred to me that Carl and I had been attempting to do to get you to be yourself uniquely, to find your own unique song to sing, as Larry LaShawn would say, was that you are most yourself when you know that you are loved unconditionally, and because of other work I had done as a scholar trying to make sense of suffering, and found that when I looked at the different philosophical systems, that there are actually only two major beliefs that run through those systems. One is the golden rule, the consensus belief within all religious, metaphysical, philosophical systems is treat others the way you'd like to be treated. And there's a great reason for that. If you really understand thought and energy, and everything you do is energy, there's the absolute rationale for why you want to do that. And you do reap what you sow. But I can tell you that on an energy level. So that one makes perfect sense. But the other one that's a lot to wrap yourself around is we are one with God. We are one with everything. And so that was just one of those moments for me where that somehow came together, that if, and this is a huge if, and I think back to when Bruce and I were talking about Baird Spalding, writing books, and I hope you have those books in your library. My God. There are a series of 5 books, but just that first one got my attention so well, about a research trip that a group made to observe and live with masters in the Far East. My God in heaven. And I am absolutely convinced to this day that if you can get into that space where you recognize your oneness and feel totally loved, that whatever you're thinking or doing at that time, that literally, and I'm not making this up, you could move mountains. Cancer is kid stuff. But I know that's a pretty strong statement, but it's just, that's what I believe is the lesson of cancer and chronic disease, besides just a general statement, and forgive my attempt at a sense of humor to make this one statement, but related still to that what's really underlying disease are psychosocial, spiritual factors. And if we just focus on symptom management, it's not going to get it done. So anyhow, imagine I stepped on a nail, and now I've got a nail sticking up through my shoe into my foot. So my foot hurts. So off I go to the doctor. And I let my doctor look at my foot and tell him it hurts, and he goes, no kidding. You've got a nail sticking in your foot. So he said, here are your options for treatment. 1, we can anesthetize your foot. 2, we can put a great big thick pad in your shoe and distance that nail from your foot. 3, we can cut your foot off. 4, pull out the nail. So forgive my, what wasn't very funny example, that the key is pulling out the nail. And until we pull out the nail, you're going to be anesthetizing your foot indefinitely. Did that make sense? So I know that you know this in a way, and maybe an easy way to think about this is, when did your first symptoms appear? And ask yourself, what was going on in your life at that time? I know it's what I like to do as a therapist. Okay, when you come in and whatever the presenting symptoms, so what was going on in your life? Oh, it was about 2 weeks after my younger brother died. Duh. But if you listen to yourself or to others, you usually know, but you don't think in terms of, well, that's what really triggered this, got this started. Although I will tell you almost certainly that it has its roots in childhood and low self-esteem and, feelings of rejection and not feeling loved. But anyhow, I want to make sure I just make this general comment about what happens early on, and that there are factors that underlie a physical disease process. And if we're not going to deal with those, in my opinion, you're not going to change chronic disease from being chronic. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I did pretty well. We're close to 8. But what we'll do, we'll take our break. It'll just give us more time for question and answers, because I don't know how much time you take, 10 minutes anyhow, maybe? Okay, so whatever time you're used to taking, let's please do that. But then I welcome your questions and comments for the whole second part of this. And otherwise, no, truly, I'm very open to your questions or comments. And rather, again, than I just go on and keep talking, I'd prefer to respond to your questions as a way of completing the presentation.
Can we get a hold of you through the Metaphysical Library? Maybe Hearn, you have his phone number and information.
Sure.
Right. I have a website, www.deanshrock.com, and you can certainly reach me through email, and my phone number's there. I'm just a person. Again, I can be reached. Yep. Yes, sir.
Several weeks ago, the local food editor at one of the local papers announced that she had been cured of cancer, I think she called it advanced cervical cancer, through diet. And then she went on to describe what I seemed to me to be a pretty darn good diet. What is your view on curing of cancer through diet?
Okay. Firstly, that is absolutely not my expertise.
Okay.
But the 3 major variables in wellness are nutrition, physical exercise, and stress management. So nutrition is extremely important. I simply am not expert in telling you, to eat certain foods and you will reverse cancer. What I prefer to think as a way to approach cancer is to think more about the immune system than the cancer. For example, if I were to hold up a test tube and tell you that we put that cancer cell in there, and then we put a white blood cell in there, your immune system, do you know what would happen? They do get out. That cancer cell would be lunch. But see, that's not the image people have of cancer. They think it's this big, bad, awful thing, when cancer cells biologically are actually weak cells. And when your immune system's working properly, essentially you can't have cancer. So that's what's disturbing for me, is that we don't approach health care, cancer care, with things that are going to boost your immune system. So if you're eating poorly, you're not doing your immune system a favor at all. I guess just like I wouldn't say just approach any disease with just a psychological perspective, is absolutely you want to incorporate a reasonable diet and physical exercise. I'm just going to tell you personally, I take a product called Juice Plus. I love that product. It's a whole food product that I think makes so much sense, has a lot of good independent research behind it. It's a food, it's not a supplement. As I'm understanding nutrition today, when you take individual supplements, they are not bioavailable. They don't get absorbed by the body like they do. You need other things besides. That's why I think the vitamin E research, the vitamin C research and so forth is not coming up looking so good, because you're dealing with individual things. So a good diet makes perfect sense. The problem is, how do you eat 17 fruits and vegetables in a day? How do you eat 6, 7 berries in a day? So I'm not here just to promote Juice Plus, but that's one of the cool things you can do besides eating properly, is supplement your diet with something that's sound. And there's no way it can't help. I would just never tell you any nutritional approach or any one approach is the way I would go about dealing with a disease.
Thank you.
Yes?
I was wondering what you think research that would prove what you're talking about would look like. See, I'm being very optimistic that there is a way to get through to the scientific community to show that feeling loved actually improves people's health. How would you design that kind of study?
There's lots of research out there.
It can be done. I was saying this briefly to someone on the break about love and actually trying to define love. In my scientific training, again, as you know, everything must be objective and measurable, but that's tough with something like love. But we say you can give it an operational definition. So what behaviors would demonstrate love? So as I even talk about in my book, if we were to talk about kindness and patience and caring and things that we could observe, even though it still sounds fairly objective, that could actually be measured through that observational way and potentially then show a correlation. Or what I was able to do in my kind of research was these people were getting all the same treatment with the only other major other variable, let's say we made it teaching them to love, or what we thought we understood was love and compassion. I think then we could make a reasonable case for, okay, this was the difference between the two groups, and if, presuming the one did better, then I think we could begin to make that statement. But you know, I'm going to say to you, although we look to research, is again, I'll remind you about Eisenberg's surveys that show that people are going to other than conventional practitioners for their health care. You, as consumers, will drive that system. I work for a major entrepreneur. I guarantee you there will be people who will find a way to deliver any service that there is a way to make profitable. So as you continue to demand these alternative therapies, they will be delivered. So I really put it back on us, is to just keep saying, I want this, and if I'm an insurance company, I'm going to find a way to get it for you in a profitable way, but get it to you. Demand it. So again, while we want to look to research as like a guide, that would definitely turn some heads, but I think that's going to take forever. I think as consumers, we'll make that happen faster than looking for a research study.
I don't really understand your answer, because how can it be a question of us driving something as consumers to feel love? I mean, to me, that is
Right.
something we can do without becoming an
Excellent point. So indeed, you wouldn't have to do that, but I'm thinking about any other approach that you can do for yourself. You don't need to look to a study to determine for yourself, I need to do this.
I agree with that too. I'm sorry
Okay.
to dialogue with you, but I just had a father who died of cancer. He would only have believed a study that would have encouraged him to feel love. So I'm thinking in those terms.
Okay. I face that a lot, as you might imagine. And one of the things that I would often try to explain to the family is that you walk this very fine line between wanting to help and believing you know how to and being the antagonist. And so what is very awkward is for when we love someone, knowing what they could do that would make a difference and respecting what they choose to do or not to do. So maybe that's not much of an answer, but if I could give you an answer, the one thing you could do that would make a difference is to send them light and love. And forgive me, stay out of it. But I mean that well when I say that, because we all have our own ideas about what will heal. And I know enough that I know we don't know enough. And I'll go farther in terms of a spiritual picture, is how do you know what is their life purpose and experience? And so even when Dossie talks about prayer so much in his writings, and the two major approaches are a thy will be done approach and otherwise kind of tell God what to do approach, is that I strongly recommend in prayer or guided imagery, you end it with thy will be done. So I know this is awkward, and I wish I could tell you there's just a way to say, Dad, do what I think you should do. But it's no different than him trying to tell you to do what he thinks you should do. And that's tough. So I'm sorry. Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
There was quite a bit of research done that was done in hospitals around prayer. And they had several groups praying in different ways. And some would pray, may the sick person get well, and may their cancer be healed. And the prayer that was the most effective in all this research that was done was the prayer that just saw the person in their perfect state of being, perfectly happy and perfectly beautiful and perfectly whole and healthy. And that prayer was the most effective.
Let me add to that. This is fairly complicated. I don't know if you have in your library the book A Child of Eternity. I don't know the author. But it was written by a mother of an autistic child. And by the time she was 4, approximately, she was diagnosed as severe autistic. And appreciate if you're the parent of that child and you had a choice, do I want an autistic child or not? I'm just going to guess you wouldn't choose to have an autistic child. And so it wasn't until 9 years that this girl, I remember her name was Audrey, A-D-R-I, she learned facilitated communication. She learned to use a keyboard, or now she could actually for the first time communicate. And imagine now again you're the mother, and finally you can communicate with your child. Within an extremely short time, less than a year, Audrey's communicating a wisdom way beyond her mother. And said in great detail, she chose to be autistic, told how she set up the conditions in the womb, and it was part of her life experience to teach her mother patience, to teach herself patience, to talk about the will of God, to teach others about facilitated communication. They believed, the mother and the daughter, that being autistic was pretty cool. Joan Borisenko, by the way, worked with this mother and daughter, so it adds some credence, perhaps, to this story and experience. But I'm just telling you that just that we want someone to live or we want their lives to go a certain way may not be in their interest. And this is tough. That's why I like the idea of light and love, be there for them, stay out of the way.
I'm a cancer survivor for 12 years, breast cancer. They gave me a year and a half if I chose not to do chemo and radiation, and I did not do chemo and radiation. I'm here to testify that I am still here. The cancer has come back a couple of times, but I was involved in a cancer support group up in Seattle with this fabulous doctor who treated with immunotherapy far before his time, Dr. Glenn Warner, who's dead now. But he held a cancer support group that hundreds of people came to every week. And I just in the last, few years recognized that, and what we're speaking about, love, was really the catalyst that made this whole support group grow. Unfortunately, the AMA and FDA went after him. He was a bona fide doctor, treated with chemo and radiation for years. They took his license at 78 years old. We created an organization called Freedom for Health. We picketed, we were on TV, we did everything, and that was just one of my little things. But if anyone wants to talk to me, I've been through the gamut with lots and lots of things. And even then, no one can really tell another really. You can help, you can advise, but it's still the person's choice. I was married at the time. He said, oh, you've got to do the chemo and radiation. And one day, next day, no, you can't do it, you know. And it is quite a crossroads, is what I can tell you. But love is definitely key. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, a couple of things. One's very personal, and I haven't usually phrased it in this way. But in May of 1979, I was lucky enough to, over a couple-day period, have 3 strokes in a row. And what it taught me, and I have a background in Tai Chi and, internal energy and teaching Tai Chi and stuff like that, and other oddball things. And what I did is I was in the hospital. I got up to go to the bathroom. There was a man in another bed. I thought he was talking to me. And he wasn't. He was just talking in his sleep. I went to try to talk to him. And not only could I not say anything, but I forgot the next moment what I was going to say to him. I walked back to my bed. I tried to drink some orange juice. And I could suck it up, but it just ran. I couldn't swallow it. It just ran down my thing. So I lay down in bed and I decided, what am I going to do? Should I call for the nurse? It was around 4 o'clock in the morning. And I was guided, whatever you want to call it, to just start going with my hands and putting them up around my head and so on and so forth. And the thoughts that came to mind is that, well, what happens, and I'm not into things of military nature, but what happens if an army is on the field and the flag falls, somebody else picks it up? What happens when a person recovers from a stroke? Over a period of time, there's some rerouting and reconnecting that goes on in brain. Parts of it take over for the parts that might be atrophied or died or dead. And in about 20 minutes' time, I feel, anyway, that I rewired my brain. In a week's time, I was driving, and 2 weeks' time, I was dancing. And did I feel like a limp rag for several months? Yes. That's the personal thing. Also, for the people that aren't into the God point of view, I think it's really just also a person's belief system that you can do it. It can be connected with the supreme being concept or high self or whatever it is. There are a couple of quick stories. I'll make them brief. One is this husband and wife saw John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under Eisenhower, on TV when he weighed about 75 to 85 pounds, terminal cancer. And the husband had the same thing. And he looked so skinny. And they said to each other, gosh, if I can just keep my weight on, I'll be okay. And that sounds about as simplistic and ridiculous as, from a conventional point of view as you could imagine. So they did. They got to the point where he was eating between 5,000 and 10,000 calories a day, and eventually the cancer went away. And I think that it had a lot to do with his belief system and his loving support that he had, from his wife. Also, the next one is a man who got hit by a car when he was 83 years of age. And he kept saying to his daughter, he lived with his family, he kept saying to his daughter when he had an ache or a pain, he says, I'll feel better tomorrow. Everything will be better tomorrow. And he kept saying that. He didn't go to doctors or anything. For some reason, he had an autopsy, and what they showed is that he had recovered from certain kinds of heart problems. He had actually had cancer that had repaired itself or remissed or gone away. And so part of it is just the loving thing is if you're getting it from the outside, it's fabulous, it's great. But, it has to start with oneself as well.
Yes, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, I hope you understand when I'm referring to God, I don't mean that I'm promoting a particular belief system, Christianity versus anything else. You can label that whatever you like, this sense of connectedness. And certainly can be with another person. In fact, I used to enjoy saying that you could probably do the social support stuff, the connecting better than I could. Talking again about something you could do to help is simply being there. It reminds me of John Gray's work. The men are from Mars, women are from Venus stuff, and men and women are different. And the obvious is, of course, they're different, but one example is where males are very problem-solving oriented and analytical and goal-oriented, and women are very relationship-oriented and love to talk about it. You do not normally want to give advice, certainly unsolicited advice, to most males. So what happens is at the end of the day, you have this man and woman getting together. She wants to talk about her day, but God forbid she said she had a problem, because the natural response for the husband is to want to problem solve, and within a couple minutes you want to give him a black eye. And here's the key point, because she didn't want fixed, she wanted listened to. But it just supports more, again, about the importance of feeling listened to just be there for someone. Now, Jodine trained as a nurse, so many of us trained in different approaches to healthcare. We do feel more comfortable, I think, when we can do something more tangible to help somebody, and don't fully appreciate the value of being there. And if you're honest with yourself, maybe more than you can be with another, that's really key. In the end, I really think you don't want fixed. You want listened to. You want to know that somebody's there for you to go through this with you, and not necessarily to tell you to do something.
You know, I've had a high blood pressure plus other things like kidney problems and so on for about now 15 years. And when we lived in the Bay Area, we had Kaiser Insurance, so I went to Kaiser Hospital. When I went to Kaiser Hospital, and I've had like a dozen different doctors, my image was that I would come in there, they wouldn't look at me, they would look at the printout, and they would say, the printout shows that, oops, you're high on this, we'll give you another drug, you're low on this, we'll give you another drug. And instead of my blood pressure being lowered every time it got higher, and they gave me stronger drugs and stronger drugs. And at some point I started getting wise. I said, maybe I should take a look at some alternatives. So I went to an acupuncture school at Berkeley. And there was this third-year student, Nina was her name. And I remember going there, and she would listen to me. She would sit and listen. And sometimes she would listen for half an hour, 45 minutes. And then she would put some needles and stuff like that. When I left, I felt always better, always felt better. And I said, no, that's strange. I don't know if it was the needles. The fact that she could listen to me. So now I'm going to an acupuncturist, an Ashland acupuncturist. And I get the same kind of treatment. They hear me, My person who's working me, Jan, I can sit there. Sometimes I can talk to her and tell her, I'm really emotionally upset today. I have a lot of emotions coming up. And she would have some Chinese medical model that she would put on that, but she would hear that, And I feel there's a healing taking place. And it's really due to the fact that somebody listens. That, rather than somebody becoming very mechanical, as the Kaiser doctors were. And there were some good doctors there.
Right.
But majority of them. I think one nephrologist that I used to go to, basically, we'd talk about other things, and he would give me a hug, and I'd feel good about that, But when doctors do doctoring, and when they do medical stuff, it feels so inhumane, and then you become like a machine. You're not a human being that can heal yourself, You become like a machine. And machines do fall apart at a certain time.
Yeah, I think actually it's one of the strongest reasons why alternative approaches are becoming more popular is in conventional medicine we've lost the sense of compassion and the old idea of TLC. In fact, I write at the very end of my book, I felt like I was compelled to or someone would strike me dead. But part of the way my intuition works is I get phrases of songs. All the time I can just stop right now and get some feedback. But I can't tell you how many times in writing that book the phrase of this song came through about love and tenderness, about what really heals. Yes.
I was going to just suggest.
Medical book.
I'm sorry?
I remember reading a Tibetan medical book, a big one, and what struck me, it said that in their training, it took 7 years just to teach a doctor to feel someone's pulse.
Yeah.
Just to be able to connect with that person, feel that person. And then it would go off with like the herbs and the prayer, the good thoughts, the good intentions, right frame, the love.
Yes.
Listening is important, and also not trying to fix, as you said, and also seeing that the person is capable of handling whatever they have in front of them, and that they're perfectly built to
Can you hear that? Did you hear that?
You can repeat it. Would you?
Well, actually, if you don't mind, if you would be willing to do that. Thank you.
We're talking about listening being important, and what was the second part you said?
You didn't want to be fixed.
Yeah, and that people don't want to be fixed. But also it's important to realize that the person that's got a problem has everything they need to take care of it. And if you know that about them, when you're listening to them, that they're perfectly on track and know exactly what they're doing, then it encourages that aspect of themselves to be there. And, sort of like you're seeing the truth about them.
You just have to give them love.
Yes.
As part of your training, also say, I think everybody wants, I think in this society, I think we're trained to think that death is optional. And I think it's wonderful. I don't mean to be a defeatist here, but we're all going to perhaps meet our demise at some point. And some of your patients, it sounds like they have perhaps as well. Isn't this oneness, the other side of it, is trying to come to grips with that and learning how to let go and not feeling as though the other side of rejection on this side is that you somehow failed if perhaps you need to come to that point where you need to let go.
Yes.
And that if you spend all of your time resisting, that perhaps you miss out on some other aspects of living.
Yes, this is another very awkward situation, as you might imagine. I actually am very comfortable asking people about what they think happens when they die as part of our interaction. But this is where, again, you must respect what they believe. But I certainly welcome the opportunity to maybe plant a couple seeds, and because I'm so convinced when you die, you don't die. I mean, I couldn't be more convinced. Depending on who it is, I'll joke with them, is that, especially I remember this one woman, because in particular Dorothy, is that, you've got to save me a dance. When you get there, we're going to laugh and we're going to dance. Because she couldn't dance and she wished she could have with me, But that's partly my gift, I think, is that I can be there with them for that, because I know they won't die. Yes?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross' new book, Life After Death, talks about that, and also talks about the fact that your etheric body is not diseased like this one is. So when you die, whatever the problems you had here, you won't have them there. And she backs it with some experiments that she has done with people who were totally blind and had near-death experiences. And after they were revived, the person would actually describe what they saw in that room. In their physical body, they couldn't see it.
Right.
But from some other vantage point of view, they saw all of that.
Right.
So there is that thing,
There is so much evidence, but what I found to be true is like the idea there are none so blind as those who will not see. I have worked in this field a long time, and I even know, even when I was in graduate school, if you took the exact same study and gave it to 100 scientists to make their conclusions, you gave them the data but didn't do the conclusions, based on their orientation, that's how they would draw up the conclusions. So it's very hard to remove personal bias. But again, my caution to you is in working with someone else is don't attempt to, is to respect where they are and help them in a way that they're open to being helped.
I'd suggest if you had 100 scientists, you'd have about 150 different.
Yes.
I've done hospice training with Daniel Brinkley. It's called the CIA, Compassion in Action. And I was living in Arizona, and I did a lot of hospice work at a hospital there, facility. And the main thing that you really learn in hospice is just let them be who they are. And all you can do is flow with who they are. You learn so much compassion. You learn so much more love than you thought you could ever give. This one woman in particular had this doll that was her baby, you know, and we would just honor her with that, you know, with that love and talk to her about her baby. But it's so humbling, and so, it's like the highest work that anyone can do. That's the way I feel about it. It was just a wonderful time in my life, but I just learned so much about the dying process as well, which is a vast subject. But the love was, when all else fails, you could just witness it everywhere. It was wonderful.
Thank you. I'm smiling because I know Danian. If you ever get a chance to hear Danian, he is a kick. And of all places, I saw him on a cruise. My wife and I thought to go on a cruise for a long time, but there were a lot of parts of the cruise that didn't appeal to us. But they had an intuition cruise. That was the theme of the cruise. You actually had your conference on the cruise. Danian, Raymond Moody, Larry Dossie, Joan Borisenko, some really good people. So anyhow, if you ever get a chance to hear Danian speak, you must have him tell his story about his third near-death experience and how he's trying to have a conversation with his medical doctor who's telling him, if you don't get this surgery, you'll die, and he's trying to say, good. I have never laughed harder in my life imagining this conversation, because they couldn't have been coming from more extreme poles. This doctor absolutely did not understand Danian. Let me die, because he knew that he would be way better off. And this guy's trying to stop it and thinking he's nuts. It's a wonderful, wonderful, funny story. It was for me.
He's a wonderful person.
Yes. Yes.
The thing is about following, you know, your bliss and what really, really makes your life just a wonderful moment experience. Actually, most people have near-life experience. What the boards say, resistance is futile.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me to make a comment about, thank you, is when I worked with Carl was very interested in quality of death. And initially that sounded a little warped to me. But I understood it, but I came to understand it much more. And I'll tell you a personal story. I worked with a fellow who I got to know pretty well, and his wife. And he was pretty good at going fishing. But at some point, indeed, people fail, or their physical bodies fail. And Luke was definitely struggling. And one of the things I think that I said probably more than any other when someone would call me back, okay, what can we do? I would say to go inside, to get in touch with that wise, loving part of yourself that knows exactly what you need to do, whether you call it an inner guide, inner advisor, whatever. And Luke had learned to do this pretty well. But I remember being out at another cancer center, and when I came home, I rushed over to see Luke, and we actually did an exercise like that in his hospital bed. And he was able to get in touch with something that was very personal, very meaningful. And it was so much so that I knew actually he was going to do okay. But he really shouldn't have lived through that weekend. I need to tell you from a medical perspective, Luke was in bad shape. But he responded so well to what we did, he actually was discharged. And so when I came back to another hospital after the weekend, and I talked to Luke over the weekend, so I knew he was home. I mentioned to his physician that Luke had been discharged, and he looked at me like I was nuts. And when I told him that Luke had been discharged, he actually got mad. You're going to get mad at me for telling a story at first, so you got to stay with me, I promise you. Because what I did is not going to sound good to start. So anyhow, I mean, obviously I knew Luke was discharged and was home, but this doctor was so mad he called the hospital, you know, expecting to find that Luke had been deceased, and said, no, he's been discharged. So now he's having to deal with the fact that it's true, and he said, I'll bet you that he dies. So bear with me, this is the awkward thing, because we're just real people. Again, there's the doctor, and he's now betting me this guy's going to die, because I mean this well, but doctors don't like when things don't go the way they think they should. I'm serious, though. There's a, you know, that's what science is about, you know, if A, B.
Ego.
So anyhow, I'm standing now in front of probably at least 3 radiation therapists, a couple nurses, but I knew And it was one of those things, I went totally out on a limb and I bet him in front of these people. And we actually bet $100. But here's a novel part of it. He says, but I want 30 days. And I'm going, okay, now I know I'm on a limb, but it's just like, okay. For what it's worth, Luke lived beyond 30 days. But the point of this story about quality of death was, when you live like you're going to live, or you go fishing, and this is a true story, he literally liked to fish. The weekend before he did die, and this was after all of this, he was on the bay in Baltimore fishing with his buddies. And so what I believe in this approach, if you will really grow into going fishing, really letting yourself have that balance in your life, not only will affect your quality of life, it'll affect your quality of death. And that's not small. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about, I've never really known anybody close who's been diagnosed with cancer, but it seems like one of the first things after the doctor takes his assessment, he gives him a death sentence. You got 3 weeks, you got 2 years, blah, blah, blah. Has there ever been any studies or research or any dialogue about the possibility of a doctor just not telling a person how much time they have?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in many countries, they won't do that. I live next door to 2 physicians trained in England, and not just in England, but I happen to know them personally. They were trained that you don't tell someone you have cancer. And I know that's the case in Japan also. I wouldn't be surprised. Germany's probably one of the leading, if not the leading country in terms of understanding this stuff. So there already is a huge precedent for this. Here's the problem from our point of view in the States. It's about informed choice, and unfortunately it's about legal stuff. Is that from their point of view, they must tell you your diagnosis, your prognosis, so you can make an informed choice about treatment. And they believe that it's unethical to not do that, even though, but they don't understand as well, the placebo effect is very real. And unfortunately, in giving someone that prognosis, you create a far greater problem, in my opinion, than if you did not do that, but found another way to talk with the person without having to, you feel, cover your ass, excuse me.
Pull the nail without having to tell them that.
It's about, okay, here's your diagnosis, here's your condition, and what can we do? And we're going to do everything we can to help you in this situation. There's a story that I'm wanting to tell that keeps slipping, so I might come back to this, but there actually is a lot even written in medical journals about how to handle that. And one way is to even just start right off with a patient, how much do you want to know? And then that's an ethical way to deal with it, rather than the physician feels, I have to tell you everything, is how much do you want to know? So that, because I've been in situations where we've had patients literally sign, I've chosen not to have you tell me this, so that the physician's off the hook, and then she didn't have to deal with, the idea that, again, you're going to die in a certain time period and fulfill the expectations. I know what I wanted to tell you, and this is very disturbing to me. Women with breast cancer, we know that there is a genetic component to women who have an immediate female relative, and then increasing the probability they would also develop breast cancer. But what I bet you don't know is that when in doubling that, we're only talking about going from like 2 to 4%. The placebo effect accounts for a minimum of 35. This is not funny. So I would try to say that, but you can imagine how far it went sometimes, is we need to be very careful about this, because we're creating a much bigger problem by telling them the fact. Instead of, hey, what this really means, and helping them understand this does not mean that you're going to be the statistical norm under any circumstances.
Give them the statistics, but it's their decision whether they want to exceed that.
Yes.
Are there statistics that talk about natural healing modalities healing cancer at a higher percentage rate? There's not.
No. What's very disturbing is, in Michael Lerner's book, Choices in Healing, I believe it's called, he is as well informed as anybody, I think, about alternative choices for cancer care. And when I was doing my research, Michael wrote that there were no studies to date at that time looking at nutrition or physical exercise as a specific variable for healing with cancer. So it's a sad situation. So what I would face when I would go out to these cancer centers is maybe people really had the experience. My doctor said, well, there's no research. And I'm going, that's right, because it hasn't been done. My study, looking at the will to live with cancer, was only the second done in the world at that time. Carl's was the first 25 years before.
They don't want to fund that.
Well, they don't want to fund it. They don't understand it. You know, I don't want to make these guys out as just bad guys. They don't understand it. They don't study it. They don't understand it. It's a whole other matter to think, okay, NIH has a whole lot of money, and, you know, if they've got a new surgical procedure, a new radiation technique, chemotherapy procedure, and they only have so much money, I guarantee you they're not going to test go fishing. So that's just the reality of this. Yes?
You know, I would say, to me, it goes even deeper than that, and I think if you take a look at our culture, there's no profit in telling somebody to go fishing, you know? And unfortunately, looking at the whole medical model that we have, so much of it is based on whether there can be a drug or some method or something that's going to bring in profit. If not, then there's no interest in it.
I'd like to announce that Leonard Horowitz is coming on April 5th, and he was the head of public health and safety in New York City and researched that very topic extensively, and has a lot of really beautiful information and positive things to say. He'll be here April 5th. And well, it's actually going to require a larger space. We're going to be at the Stevenson Union. It will start at 6:30. And if you want to get an email, sign up on the back there in the Metaphysical Library. I will be co-sponsoring his visit here because he is somewhat controversial.
In fact, I laughed and shared with her, and you actually have a section in your library called Controversial Knowledge. I was like, what do you have to be controversial in this place?
Well, anything that is...
No, it's a joke, please. It's just, it caught me off guard that you guys would consider something controversial. Yes.
Well, speaking of alternative, there's a fabulous group of women in Berkeley. It's a radical cancer support group that I got involved with, years back. And one of the reasons that they don't do research is that they really can't, because these women are researching to such an extent that they're flying all over the world. They're getting treatments in Greece and in Turkey and in England and in Germany and just all over. And, you know, nothing that they would be doing would be recognized here anyway. But we did discuss that a lot, that there isn't the research, but there is a lot of doctors that are very sympathetic to the alternative. And I've met many of them in the Bay Area, in Seattle, in my travels. Yeah, there are more and more in the last 12 years since I was a cancer patient, really. More and more, and there's been a great shift in the healing modalities that are available. So there's always that hope. And along those lines, this gentleman, Paul, and I are starting a cancer support group. If you want to sign up, there's a sheet in the back, because everybody needs those hugs and that love, and so welcome.
Yes.
Yeah, not to dwell on the negative, but I think this is important to bring up. I have a friend of mine who's a very brilliant person. They kind of function more out of what I feel left hemisphere type. And very, very powerful. This man is so much powerful psychic energy, but everything has to be proven by double-blind study. And so it is also possible that many of these doctors that have a disbelief in alternative modalities can, when they give somebody a death sentence, they're projecting energy at them without even realizing.
Yeah, that's unquestionably the case. Thought is a very real energy. How are we doing? We still have time.
Well,
Yeah.
I'll just mention something. I moved to Ashland 25 years ago, and in the first short while after I arrived, I met this amazing woman walking in her house and feeling this incredible energy in her. And I said, "What do you do?" "I'm just a housewife." "No, what do you do?" And she took me into her little study, and she basically spent a lot of her day in meditation. And she was working with the teachings of a spiritual healer who taught all over the globe back in the 40s and 50s. His name was Joel Goldsmith.
Yes.
And he had an amazing practice where he healed thousands of people of cancer and thousands of people of all kinds of problems, diseases, emotional relationship problems, marital problems, whatever problem you can imagine that we've ever had in human consciousness, he had dealt with, including mongoloid children. He had also used. And his whole practice was based on one theme. Everything is perfect in true reality, and that thought that the mind and the false beliefs of human consciousness were the only thing that kept perfection from manifesting. And that if we understood that truly we are perfect and completely loved by the divine, and that we are divine ourselves, that there is absolutely no problem that cannot be corrected, because the physical manifestation immediately lifts to what we think, and it'll change right there. So his whole practice was based on the knowingness rather than the belief. And he had incredible results. So that's kind of a nutshell of what you're saying.
Okay. I just checked my notes. I decided maybe I'll tell you something more. This will take a little while, but I hope it's worth it. First, I'm going to tell you a story after I tell you what is the most stressful thing you can do or have done to you. But I have to tell you a story or two to build into that. One time I was watching television, and my wife calls the remote control the clicker. And I appear to be the fairly normal male, and when commercials come on, I'm clicking and looking to see what else might be on. So as I'm doing this, comes on an interview type show. There used to be Phil Donahue, and then God knows. It's not difficult to find some interviewer, some program, and God only knows what the interviewer, the guest, the subject matter might be. Anyhow, the gist of this interview was, and the guest was a 100-year-old man. It was his birthday that day. And the idea was how did you live to be this ripe old age? And so when the interviewer asked this older gentleman that question, he said, "It's because I've never had an argument with anyone in my life." Well, the interviewer absolutely did not understand how that could possibly be true. And so he asked him again. He said, "Did you really say the reason you've lived to be 100 is because you've never had an argument with someone?" He said, "That's right." Well, now he knows he really said it, but he just doesn't get it. So he said, "Now listen, 100 years times 365 days times 24 hours times 60 minutes, you mean to tell me in all that time you've never had an argument with anyone in your life?" He said, "That's right." Well, the interviewer actually started to get mad. His posture changed, his color changed, and basically yelled at the old man, "You can't tell me that in 100 years you've never had an argument with someone." And the old man said, "You may be right." Okay, but now I want to ask you, what's the moral of my story? Truth, I really would...
Agree with someone.
Surrender. Let it go.
Right, and while I agree with it, which triggered, your comments triggered that story, is I want to throw it back at you and say, when was the last time you really disagreed with someone and you said, "You may be right"? And my challenge to you, let me just finish a little bit. My challenge is you, I don't know you, but I know, is that the probability is that you are invested in a certain belief and you can't just let it go. When the wisdom, if you at least appreciate the 100-year-old man, was, indeed, what was the point of getting into the argument? So let me just continue. I promise to come back to you, sir. Another interesting fable to add to this is the story of a man and his father in a third world setting going off to market, and they have to travel a long distance. They load their donkey, and they both start to walk at first, and they're going to pass through many small villages before they get to the central market. And as they pass through the first village, they hear people comment, you know, you'd think one of them would ride that donkey. They've got a long distance to go. So the father puts his son on the donkey, and they proceed, and they get to the next village, and someone says, isn't that something, the boy riding the donkey making his older father walk? So the boy gets off, the father gets on. They get to the next village, and someone remarks, you think they'd both ride that donkey? So they both get on the donkey. They get to the next village, and someone says, look at that poor donkey. All loaded down with the goods, the father and son. So they both get off the donkey, and the son ties the front legs of the donkey together. The father ties the back legs of the donkey together, and they carry the donkey through the next village. Okay, what's the moral of that story?
Don't be so gullible.
Everybody has a different point of view.
Right, everybody has a different point of view. You can't please everybody. I wished, in fact, in my experience, you guys could really practice that. Because, again, in my experience, is that if I were to say to you which villager's right, in fact, let me do that for you. Which villager was right?
All of them were right.
There's no
All right,
answer.
but that's an unusual response. Usually what people do is none of them. But what I would hope you would understand is all of them. But here's what will get a scientist crazy. That can't be true. How could they all be true? And so what I'm going to get to is this idea of different experience, different realities. And so peace of mind comes when you realize you'll never have it figured out. You'll never be in complete control. And here's the kicker. It doesn't matter. Yes, sir.
Your first example there really strikes a note with some experience and some of my experience. My dad died of prostate cancer just a couple years ago. I watched him go through it. It was extremely painful. He was in quad morphine shots twice, 3 times a day. You know, it was extremely painful because it had grown into his nerves, etc. He tried an alternative cancer treatment, shark cartilage and all that, and it just didn't work out for him. And I remember standing next to him in his kitchen, and he was mixing up one of these tonics. And I said, you know, Dad, you could drink that stuff, but you know, you're gonna have to change some things. Not just drink that tonic. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, you have stuck energy. You have stuck energy here. You need to flow your energy. Just let it go. You need to just learn how to flow your energy so it doesn't get stuck. I said, it's like looking on a burl on a tree. Most of the tree just has these beautiful flowing lines. Look at a redwood or a cedar. It just comes straight up like this. It's gorgeous. All the energy just flows straight up. As you look at a burl on the side of it, it's all knotted and twisted. It's like a cancer. It doesn't really support the tree. It's a growth on the side that doesn't really go anywhere or do anything. It's fancy when you slice it and make a table out of it, but it doesn't really do anything other than that. You know, it's all wound up because that tree didn't really flow its energy. It got little disease and didn't get the right help or whatever. But I think that you're holding your energy down here in your crotch between your legs for whatever reason, out of guilt or you're repressing. You're holding it somehow. You're not letting it go. You're not flowing it. Now, I've spent several classes, many years actually, learning to flow energy and learning to deal with energy, ground, to bring up Mother Earth energy and flow it down in and mix it and do the sun globe, all kinds of things. It gets pretty deep. I don't want to get, have there been any studies about flowing energy, about releasing, about grounding, about learning how to channel? No, I don't mean channel like you're channeling something from the sky. There's mixed feelings about channeling. And so but what I'm saying is my question is has there been any studies where people learn how to flow their energy in straight lines, in good healthy ways, and how that affects disease?
To answer your question, first, I'm not sure, but I doubt it. I know that Herbert Benson at Harvard has done a lot of work with TM in particular, looking at meditation as a way to affect a less stressful response in the body. He called his first book The Relaxation Response. Carolyn Mace has written about this, but in terms of actual studies, I really doubt that, honestly. I don't think that people have the resources or the interest to put the kind of money in to do that properly. So I don't think so, but I really like Carolyn Mace's work. If you read the book she first put out with Norm Shealy, how he looked at the medical aspects of a disease, and she talked about the spiritual parts. I remember when I first read that, because one of the medical issues they talked about was TMJ, which my wife happened to have. So I was curious to show it to my wife and say, what do you think about this? And the issue, according to Carolyn, is why people have TMJ. They hold the energy there, but it's about not speaking up for yourself, and that's why the target organ as such is your jaw. And so I was fascinated by this because I'm fairly good about speaking up and speaking out, but my wife is more gentle generally and tends to hold things in and not speak up for herself. So I thought, oh my God, I may be actually part of the problem, or in a way part of the solution. I honestly believe people are attracted to each other many times because you're very different to help each other balance. Anyhow, when she read this, and I thought maybe this would be good then to talk about it, and we did for maybe half an hour. That night, for the first time in years, she had no TMJ. So I saw it just as a story that I know there's something to that, and I've learned to respect Carolyn Mace's, what she calls herself some medical intuitive, but that she apparently has pretty good insight into some issues that underlie the medical symptom part of it. Run out of time? Okay. Thank you very much.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.